All righty. Can we talk a little bit of regular wrestling for a second? The good old fashioned wrestling. Did you watch the Flair and Dusty A&E Rivals television program? I'm trying to figure out what all these things are called and pull out my notepad at the same time. That it's on the A&E network. It's WWE Rivals. And the last weekend was on the rivalry between Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, which happened obviously in the NWA and primarily Crockett Promotions in the mid-'80s is what they focused on. Did you see the program?
I did see the program. I was curious to hear what you were going to say about it. Obviously, you lived through it both as a fan in the early days and then eventually as their colleague during the 1986 Bash.
And, you know, that was part of the cool part about it is seeing again, we always say with the old footage, this time at least we can say it's old footage to almost anybody, because they went back to the stuff, the Florida footage from the Florida video library probably goes back as far as any NWA territory went back in terms of the early 70s stuff. And they even saved a few, you know, black and white masterpieces that one of these days will surface. And Dusty, we had early footage of Dusty also in the AWA, because Vern saved a lot of his stuff. And, you know, so this was a chance to see some of the stuff that hasn't been beaten to death from the Attitude Era again, as we always put it over. But especially because that Florida footage was high quality. Was that Dusty versus Race title change in 1979 in Tampa? That was Eric Soley doing the shooting on film at that time, wasn't it?
It was one of Gordon Soley's sons, and I always get a few of them confused.
It was Eric. It was Eric then. If it was, because what they were doing was after everybody else had gone to videotape, which, you know, yes, it lasted longer, and they were doing their TV show on videotape. I'm not trying to say they're not, but the arena footage, instead of just having a guy shooting with a video camera, Eric Soley was still shooting film to where they could do kind of an NFL Films presentation of a match or a training session. They could do the really cool slow motion stuff that made, if something looked real in slow motion, they would show it, because that way to people, well, shit, that looked real in slow motion. I mean, it's fucking simple shit, right? But it worked. And I think that footage is so much cooler than a lot of the other territories at that time period that were in early videotape era mode. Do you concur, Great Brian Last?
I think the film stuff all looks really cool. I am a mark for like Madison Square Garden stuff from the 70s, just that arena feel. And it's on video. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But the Mid-Atlantic stuff you have, the stuff I've seen out of Florida, I love the way that stuff looks. More so than the VTR stuff they started doing in Atlanta when they started shooting video. I think it was video. The early days that I'm shooting video at the Omni, up high, it didn't look so good.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing, is that they got away with it. We're going to get off on a tangent here, but what the fuck? Like, the whole goddamn show hadn't been. In Memphis, the camera that far up in the stands as a one camera shoot that could catch everything in the ring or around ringside, that's the idea behind it. If you've only got one camera, you want to be able to shoot everything so that they don't miss anything. And that's why they'd always put that stationary camera up there, and it was easy in the old days, tripod, whatever. In Memphis, it looks better because Memphis had that unique Coliseum lighting. They didn't really have a set of ring lights, and it was bizarre at the time for any of the major buildings in the territories to have that much light during the matches, but they made it work. But in some of the buildings, it was goddamn, you know, so far back and so dark, it was almost impossible to get a good shot. And so when And Memphis then did this when they switched to a 2-camera where they could edit tape fairly easily in some of the territories in the office, and they did this in Memphis, one camera in the stands and the other one on the floor. Then with a 2-camera shoot, a lot of these territories realized they could almost do their own TV if it came to that. But nevertheless, we digress. The point is, they gave the history of Flair training, briefly in the AWA, and having watched Dusty because he was already a star there, and wanting to be Ramblin' Ricky Rhodes and driving Dusty and Murdoch around. But, the cool thing you mentioned, I started as a fan and then later on worked with him. It was 3 years between the time that Flair was driving Dusty and Murdoch around in the AWA and the time that Flair was a main event guy in the Carolinas, co-main eventing and probably wrestling. I don't know when their very first match was against Dusty for the U.S. title or some major main event in the Carolinas. From 73 to 76, they both got exponentially bigger as stars. And then, then the rivalry starts really with, they didn't cover this. They're mainly going with the world title changes and working off those into the Crockett era. But what would you say their first main event matches easily in the Carolinas by 76 or 77, Flair and Dusty, that drew money, and they had more than just a passing, and also in Georgia, Flair was in and out a lot at that point, and Dusty at that era owned TBS, so I'm sure they had some interaction without even looking at record books. They really had a program from 76 to into 87, did they not?
I don't know how early you could say it started, because Dusty he made appearances in certain towns in Mid-Atlantic in the 70s once he became a star out of Florida. And 81 was the title change. And Flair started going into Georgia by 78, I think, right? Maybe I'm wrong, 79? Maybe 78? So I don't know exactly how early or where it started. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There used to be a Ric Flair record book, Steve Hellwagon. Remember him?
Yes, I've got it somewhere, but it's longer than the cord to my headphones. But the point is, at least it's not on. And by the way, this show apparently did a really nice rating compared to some of the others they've been presenting. But the point is that this wasn't either one of these deals where they had an 8-year rivalry comprised of 4 matches, or that this was a classic rivalry that lasted for 9 months of a calendar year. It was the 2 biggest names in at least all of the NWA territories and what they eventually coalesced into, fighting over most of the time either the world title or the top belt that it was available. And people still remember it so well to this day that it's outrated, some of the rivalries from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when you would think more of these people would have been alive. I find that heartwarming, don't you?
And the stuff holds up. When you watch Flair and Dusty, just at least from the Crockett era on TBS, it looks good still. Even in that small studio, those promos look great. And they sound great. And it sounds better than everything now.
It's the emotion. It feels natural. It even if you think that wrestling, if the guy sit at home and say, wrestling's fake, but you don't think that anybody wrote that anybody told them to say that even if you knew something's going on, you didn't know what and what the fuck. At that point, you don't care, because here's these guys, polar opposites of each other. The nature boy and the tailor-made suits and the women and the hair. And there's Dusty with the bandana and the gigs on his head and the son of a plumber, and completely diametrically opposed. And most people, identified with Dusty, especially through the territory days. And then, the younger guys started thinking Flair was cool and emulating him, but still everybody was involved. It wasn't like these guys have been told what to say. And truly with Dusty, nobody was. He was telling other people what to say. And then he wasn't telling Flair what to say, by the way. Just what they were selling, but not what to say. And you didn't feel like that people were telling them how to act, and et cetera, et cetera. It was more organic, as the young folks say. And that's why the footage holds up, because there's still that level of emotion and passion or whatever's in it. They were all the way in it. Nobody was, neither Dusty nor Flair nor anybody else in this deal was winking at people over their, level of dedication to what was going on.
Were you surprised to hear that Bash 86 sold out every night? And are you wondering where your money is?
Well, I was still wondering where my money was when I already knew it didn't sell out every night. But at the same time, in all fairness, where else could a young 24-year-old whippersnapper like myself make the modern equivalent of $60-something thousand in today's money? Doing what I'm doing right now, I get. But nevertheless, but that was the thing, being there for a lot of this. And at least I was in the business. Well, Flair and Dusty in Kansas City was on my birthday in 1981 when I was still a photographer, my 20th birthday. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I apologize, birthday boy, for interrupting you. I was going to say, I do like that Flair's honest enough to say, yeah, it sucks that it was in Kansas City.
Well, and I'd forgotten, because that is a match that nobody wants to ever go back and look at. And I'd forgotten that Luthez was the referee. But yeah, like Rick said, it was terrible. Kansas City, I mean, we've talked about the Kansas City territory, but that's kind of, in every, ribbing, stereotype, joking thing lies some element of truth. Kansas City was deader than Kelsey's nuts, even then. And Rick said Dusty didn't want to lose, and he probably didn't. But at the same time, I don't think in that substandard ring and poor Luthez, with all due respect, he was
wearing the same referee shirt for 20 years.
Well, yes, that's one thing. He threw my focus on my camera off at the Omni when he wore that shirt. But he was 65, I'm trying to do the math, 65 years old, and not the greatest, most experienced referee. They had a shit ring in a dead town, because political reasons, because Harley was part owner of Kansas City and Bob Geigel, but they do the title change there, and it just, it would bleh, everything. But then Dusty ends up a couple years later, he's going in the Carolinas and becomes the booker, but Flair's still the top guy, and you got a classic situation. And it was the two, really, Harley was about to pass the torch. And by the way, that's one of the first things that I heard before I even got into business officially, but I was smart as a photographer. The story going around was the next champion was either going to be Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, or Ted DiBiase. But the reason why Teddy never got it was because he's the one that leaked the story that the next champion was either going to be Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, or Ted DiBiase.
I never heard that angle of it, really.
Yes, that's what the only, I mean, and I want to be fair to Ted. Wrestlers say a lot of things about Tommy Rich and Barnett with the NWA title, but that was the scuttlebutt at the time was, that was Ted DiBiase told.
It's interesting, though, if you think about how the champion would have been picked in 81 and where the votes were coming from. Dusty had Eddie Graham in the pocket. You have to think he had Georgia, maybe. Flair would have had Crockett. Flair maybe If Fritz wasn't voting for one of his kids, Flair probably maybe had Fritz. Who would DiBiase have other than maybe Sam Muchnick in his final year as a full-time promoter?
Well, because who went into Missouri and became the Missouri champion was always highly featured as a top babyface in those days.
Yeah, Dusty didn't go into St. Louis, really, did he?
But Ted DiBiase did.
That's right.
He was to Sam Muchnick, I'm sure he probably saw a modern Lou Thez at that point in Ted's career. But nevertheless, but then they get to Crockett, and after Starrcade 83, Flair's got the belt, and now Dusty's the booker, and then they had the classic, TBS promo clips and stuff, and that's what I got a kick out of being there for so much of it, because we got there in, summer of 85. So for 3 years, every Saturday, you would get to hear fucking Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes cut sometimes multiple promos, because we were doing most of the time, not 2 shows in terms of 2 weeks of shows, but at the start, we would do every Saturday morning, the Saturday night and Sunday night studio shows on Saturday morning, and then go somewhere that night and have the house show. But you would get to hear fucking countless of these, and either right behind the curtain watching the monitor in the little, I can't call it a dressing room, in the little storage slash, fucking office area that they had us dress in, or if you could sneak into the control room, or you're involved in them. And they were just, that's the thing. You can see all these clips and say, oh, I remember that one. I remember that one. I remember that one. And then you realize Flair and Dusty were both doing shit every goddamn morning like that. Hungover in many cases, that you still remember 40 years fucking later.
I was surprised if he had said it before. I just had never seen the quote. But when Dusty said, I think the quote was, he made more for the payoff of Starrcade 83, where he was just an executive producer, really, than he ever had as a wrestler. That was incredible to hear.
Yes. But think about this.
And he wasn't on the show. For anyone who doesn't know, Dusty didn't wrestle on Starrcade 83, I don't believe.
No. But it was his vision, his, idea. He pushed to take that step and make them make that step. And that became the thing. Is I've always said, even your main event wrestler in a territory in those days, the pay scale was not going to be that your regular main event territory wrestler was going to make more than the booker, whether the booker was also wrestling or not. A lot of that's why a lot of fucking promoters liked a booker that was also a top wrestler, because you didn't have to pay him double what you see where I'm going with this? Whatever you'd pay the main event wrestler, you could pay him another 500 a week, 1,000 a week out of 1,500, whatever the fucking scale was, instead of having to pay completely double for a booker that you'd have to pay more than that wrestler. Because if you took a job in those days as the booker and were making less than any of the wrestlers, except if a wrestler was an owner, you were a fucking idiot. Did I get off on a tangent there?
It's a good tangent. We've had some good tangents today.
Well, but so the point is that yes, Dusty that's what he aspired to and wanted to do. And now, having said that, with Ric Flair in the same company, being the NWA World Champion, that position there carried a level of status that at one time you were mandated by the gate to make a certain amount of money. And of course that went away with some of the old conventions also. But the point is, so you would have a dick swinging contest there between the world champion on 10% and the goddamn booker who's orchestrating the whole show. And that's what made this rivalry again between Flair and Dusty so fucking good to people. And they didn't even have to talk about the 100 or 150 house show matches, I'm sure, that they did between 84 and early 87. When Flair got branched off into other, programs full time. And you know, it just, that's the thing, is that you see the way that Dusty orchestrated the chase and then the final emotional payoff when he would capture it. You can see that in Cody in a modern presentation way. But they ended this show up with the Great American Bash '86, where that was the big selling point there. That summer was Flair was going to defend the title at all 14 of the Great American Bashes, and the insinuation was in the announcers' verbiage in that it was all going to be against different people, right? And they tried to do that because Robert Gibson challenged Ric Flair that year for the Great American Bash in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and did a $101,000 gate.
Wow.
They had never had
wow.
so many human beings in in Fayetteville. What's the name of the building? Son of a bitch. I thought I'd never forget it. But at the time, I don't know how many people the building held, but at those ticket prices, if it held 5,000 supposed to be, there was 6,500 in it. Whatever, the walls were sweating, the humidity was so bad, and they were shooting for television. People were passing out, and people were standing near, like vultures, near the older people that they thought might pass out so they could take their fucking seat. But anyway, the point is, Ricky Morton in Charlotte at the stadium got the shot, and he defended it. So Flair defended against all the top baby faces, really every baby face on the card, with some duplication. And then finally, Dusty won in Greensboro, which was the spiritual home of not only of Starrcade, but of him starting this particular odyssey almost 3 years before, of being the booker and for Crockett Promotions. And when Dusty did the formats for the syndicated television, back when we were actually on real TV stations, that they would shoot every Tuesday with the Nemo truck and blah, blah, blah. Instead of the A show and the B show for NWA Pro and Worldwide Wrestling, it would be the A show and the G show on his formats, because the G show, he wrote specially for Greensboro because it aired at a great time slot there. And he would follow it if it aired in Philadelphia too, fine. But he thought of Greensboro when he wrote that show because Greensboro had such potential to do such big money and did so often. Anyway, and then Flair and Dusty both instantly became mentors and coaches. And it just skipped over the next fucking 25 years of their careers.
It skipped over all the stuff where they hated each other for real.
Well, you guys, the
real rivalry that was going on behind the scenes.
You got to really, Brian, you got to get over these things. You got to move on. You got to have a happy life. But I guess that ultimately the lesson is learned again that the older the Rivals episode is, the better it's going to be, because the footage stands up so much better because they weren't telling everybody what to fucking do all the time.
And the other thing is the footage and the story of the footage and the story of Flair and Dusty is a whole lot better. You didn't need, again, the panel that they keep going to in the mysterious, Jesse Ventura spy room, whatever's happening over there.
It does look like there is some element of world takeover plottage going on in there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But they didn't include the promos with Flair and Dusty for the Crockett Cup in the Superdome '86. That was the best example of it. They could play those now and people would understand them. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Flair Dusty promos from the Crockett Cup? I'm not sure.
On TBS, at least it popped all the boys. And at the time, almost nobody else understood what the fuck was going on. This was where the smart fandom was in its infancy. But I'm trying to think of which one sniped first. I think it was Dusty. He was wound up and he was cutting a promo on Flair because they were the main event for the NWA title on the nighttime session of the Crockett Cup Tag Team Tournament, first one ever at the New Orleans Superdome in April 1986. And Dusty gets wound up and saying, just remember, baby, I don't do no jobs in front of 60,000 people. And all the boys in the locker room, oh shit, he said, I don't do no jobs. And most people didn't know what's fucking, but then Flair came out a little bit later on and said, well, let me tell you something, Big Dust. I don't do any jobs in front of 60,000 people either. So where does that leave us? God damn it. What are we doing? This was the modern equivalent of a fucking shoot promo. What have we become here? We're fucking using jobs on television. And it went by a lot of do you remember that?
I do remember that now that you said that. I didn't know exactly what you were referring to. I remember reading about it in an old Observer.
Yeah.
And then I saw the promos too when I went through all the TBS episodes in chronological
order. Yeah, because
order.
I was even like, I'm managing the fucking World Tag Team Champions. If I went out there and said, we're not going to do a job, they'd probably fire me. But it's the goddamn Booker and the World Champion. And I think they were still fucking discussing at that point in time exactly what the finish was going to be.
Apparently he's a big influence on Shawn Michaels.
That's where he idolized Flair. I don't do no jobs in front of 60,000 people, brother. So where does that leave us?